Hello. My name is John Stomberg. Notice the pause there. I had to try and remember my name. I'm the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961 S Director of the Hood Museum of Art, and I'm very pleased to have you all here tonight. A few little bits of housekeeping. Could you please turn off your cell phones or mute them out of respect for our speakers? It's very distracting when they happen to go off. I'd also like to point out the emergency exit. It's in the unlikely event that it's needed, it's right there. And I think we've got plenty of seats, and I'm really hoping that you enjoy the program. I'll be back in a moment to say a few words, but first it is my great pleasure to introduce an alum who's done pretty well for himself, a member of the class of '77, the president of Dartmouth College, Philip Hanlon.
Thank you, John, and I'm glad you got the year right. I had an interview with a well-intentioned student yesterday, and one of the questions that the student asked was, "What did it feel like to have my 50th reunion?" So I guess when you're 20, everybody my age looks like they're 70 or something. But anyway, good evening. What a thrill to have so many of you gathered in Gilman Auditorium in this incredible renovated Hood Museum of Art at a time when there's so much to celebrate. John Stomberg described this event as the exclamation point concluding the grand reopening of the Hood, a celebration that's actually been going on all year and the beginning of an exciting new chapter for this most cherished place. And I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate John and his team and our architects, Todd and Billy, for this amazing outcome in the renovation and expansion of the Hood. So thank you, John. That was great. And of course, we're celebrating another great milestone this year, which is the 250th anniversary at Dartmouth, the sesquicentennial. You probably may not know that word, but sesquicentennial. And such anniversaries, they present us with a unique opportunity to both reflect on the past and imagine the future. And I can't think of a better way to honor Dartmouth's evolution and the evolution of museums more generally than with a gathering of remarkable Dartmouth alumni working in the museum world. As directors and conservators, communicators and educators, fundraisers and board members, the collective cultural influence of those in this room is breathtaking. It's somewhat intimidating even. You represent some of the most revered museums, art and otherwise, anywhere on the planet. The Smithsonian, the Met, the Zeitz, just to name a few. And to have you here to share your perspectives on the future of museums is a privilege, and of course for all of us at Dartmouth, it is a tremendous source of pride. Each of you is a testament to the power of the liberal arts, the intellectual skills that come from a Dartmouth experience, critical thinking, the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to work across difference, the capacity to connect the dots between disciplines and synthesize complex issues. Nowhere are those skills brought more powerfully to bear than in the museum setting. And you and the institutions that you proudly represent are living proof of exactly that. Now I say that because museums are places where disparate disciplines converge, places that treasure and teach those very same skills in the liberal arts tradition in a highly experiential way. So tonight, I want to simply say thank you. I want to say thank you for your leadership in the museum world. I want to say thank you for representing Dartmouth and all that Dartmouth stands for so effectively. So to John Stomberg and the incredible team at the Hood, thank you for being in lockstep with Dartmouth's educational mission and global ambitions. And to all of you in the audience, please enjoy each other, please enjoy this meeting, learn, and enjoy together. So thank you.
Thank you. For those of you who know President Hanlon, you know he's usually wearing a sport coat. He's dressed down a little bit tonight because he's going to see the undefeated Big Green play Columbia in football. But I just wanted to, just before you go, I wanted to mention that the Hood team is now 37 years in running undefeated. So we continue to go. Thank you very much. That was terrific. I will say, I spend a lot of my time explaining to audiences around the country what President Hanlon thinks about the arts and the role of creativity in a liberal arts setting. We were beyond thrilled when he offered to join us this evening to share his thoughts directly. So thank you again, Phil. It means the world to us that you stay so involved with the Arts District and all of our activities. As Phil mentioned, this is the third in our series of opening year events. When we began planning the reopening, it became clear that our ambitions far outstripped what we could accomplish with one event. We wanted to celebrate the whole Hood, its body, soul, and mind. And so we developed 3 distinct events. In late January, we celebrated our new building, lovingly and brilliantly designed by Todd Williams and Billy Shen, and the donors who gave so generously to make that possible. In the past 9 months, this new body, our building, has served us well and has proved deserving of its opening day accolades. And then in May, we turned to the collection and the artists who make the art we work with every day. Art is the soul of the Hood Museum. That day, we were joined by 12 amazing creators who shared deeply their thoughts about making and exhibiting art, as well as joining the special family that is generated when collections are formed. Now today, we kick off for the third and last opening celebration. We turn to the mind of the Hood, the how and why of our programming. We have invited museum professionals from near and far, and I mean that literally, to share their aspirations, challenges, and successes within the field as a pathway to understanding more about the Hood and its special place within the field. Also, as this is the 250th anniversary of Dartmouth, a college dedicated to the liberal arts, we have decided to feature all alumni panelists this weekend. These professionals work in many different segments of the art and museum worlds, but in common graduated from Dartmouth and are working to make museums matter in an ever-changing and hopefully ever-expanding demographic. So with that, I want to thank all of our staff for doing such a great job in organizing this conference. There are many, many moving parts, and you have been on top of them all. And also, nobody in this room is going to be surprised. I do want to single out Kathy Hart, Senior Curator for Collections and Hood Curator for Academic Programs. The fact that almost everybody in this room knows Kathy or knows of her is testimony to the deep impact she has had on generations of people involved with the Hood. Kathy, thank you so much for organizing this event. Yay! You always amaze. Wow. So thank you too to all the speakers, including 2 from our own staff who are alumni and work on our staff, who have taken time out of your busy careers to return to Hanover for this occasion. We're honored to have you all here. So now I'm about to turn it over to Megan Fontanella, class of 2004, who will introduce the first panel. Megan is a curator of modern art and provenance at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. That's in New York City. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Since joining the institution in 2005, Megan has worked on over 30 exhibitions for the Guggenheim's extended constellation of museums in Berlin, Bilbao, New York, and Venice, as well as organized shows elsewhere for the Traveling Exhibitions program. Megan The most important fact here is this next one. Megan received her BA in art history, modified with history from Dartmouth, and went on to receive her MA in art history from the Courtauld Institute in London, where she specialized in late 19th century French art. She serves as chairperson of the Career Support Advisory Group for the Association of Art Museum Curators and is a member, importantly, of the Hood Museum of Art Advisory Board. Welcome, Megan.
Yeah, come on up, come on up. Good evening, and thank you for that warm welcome. So it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce our first panel, Museum Practices, Futures, Directions. In a moment, you will hear from 4 art world professionals, each who has had a very unique path to his or her current position. Whether curators or cultural ambassadors, mentorship and early training certainly played a key role, I would say, in each of their career development. I began my own museum career at the Hood as a curatorial intern during my senior year at Dartmouth. And it was here that I gained my first practical experience in activating collections. And I will say that this experience has really stayed with me, and this deep interest in the lives of objects and the stories they may tell certainly is part of my work today at the Guggenheim. Yet my colleagues and I also find that we are at a moment when our professions in the art world are increasingly varied and demanding, and we are called upon to be more flexible, more responsive amidst the complexities of our global digital era. Among other things, we are taking a closer look at who we represent in our collections and our displays, not to mention the audiences we attract and those we would like to attract. We are endeavoring to disrupt expectations and to create moments for transformative experiences with art. And we are challenging museums to remove historical barriers to cultural professions by implementing paid internships and fair compensation. We anticipate a rich conversation will unfold over the course of this conference and on these topics and many more. So now I will introduce our first speaker, Elisabeth Sherman, who is Dartmouth class of 2006. And Elisabeth is an assistant curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She is working on 2 forthcoming exhibitions, Making, Knowing, Craft and Art, 1950 to 2019, which opens at the Whitney in November of this year, and Dawood Bay, an American Project, which opens at SF MoMA in February of 2020 before traveling to the High Museum in Atlanta, and then it'll come to the Whitney in the fall of 2020. And Elisabeth most recently oversaw the Whitney's presentation of Zoe Leonard in 2018. So welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you so much, Megan, for the introduction. And for those of you who I did know during my time at Dartmouth, you might more commonly remember me as Libby, but these days I am trying to be professional. I think you're going to hear a lot of these sentiments this evening and tomorrow, but since I have the pleasure of being your first speaker for our day together, I just want to share that as the Dartmouth coach pulled up over the bridge and we pulled into Hanover, and I got to walk around campus a little bit this afternoon. You know, there are very few moments in our lives where we have a chance to really reflect on who we were and where we've come and how we got there. And I think I was so caught up in the logistics of today and tomorrow and what I was going to say that part really passed me over. And I was just struck by walking through my memories, thinking about taking Professor Kenz's class and coming to see Rembrandt etchings in the Hood Study Center and learning the difference between dry point and etching and these things that I will never forget. And I absolutely would not have thought I would be where I am today speaking to all of you in the capacity that I'm in. And so it's a real joy and pleasure and something I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do. So with that, to move a little bit away from Hanover and back to New York City. I wanted to speak to you today about the current project that I'm working on, but in the context of current practices in museum collection displays and how institutions are thinking about what does it mean to have a collection and what does it mean to exhibit that collection, and how do we create and rewrite narratives about the history of art using our collection. So many of you may know, but some of you may not, that in 2015, I'm looking at a former Whitney colleague in the audience right now, so feeling slightly bashful when I say this because we were part of this project together, but in 2015, the Whitney moved from its home of many, many decades down to the meatpacking district in Lower Manhattan with a brand new Renzo Piano designed building that increased our square footage dramatically. And I'm saying all of these things to many people who've just undergone the same project right here. But one of the main impulses for the new building was not really just for temporary exhibitions, but primarily where we increased the greatest square footage was for the permanent collection. Up at the old Breuer building, we had a very small floor where the collection that began in the early 20th century could only be seen in even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what we'd hoped to be able to do. And so being in this new building now for 4 years, opening with our inaugural display that was entirely the collection, and then having a number of chances to iterate through, we're learning a lot and experimenting with this new form. So what we've been doing in the new building is, instead of thinking of a permanent collection as a static display, one that visitors can return to time and time again and expect to see Edward Hopper on this wall and Georgia O'Keeffe on that wall, we're really trying to unpack what I think many of us in the museum profession, in art history, understand intuitively, but doesn't get played out that frequently, that a collection and art history are not one story. There's a multiplicity of stories. There are absences, there are presences. Individuals create these stories. There are curators, former Whitney directors in our audience who make these stories in any particular moment, and then the audience receives them as if they're doctrinaire. And so we have been trying to be both undermining that attitude, as well as being a little bit playful, having fun, exploring our own institutional history. And so the first attempt at these kind of temporary permanent collection exhibitions was really, I think, the most playful of them, called Human Interest: Portraits from the Whitney's Collection, which in some ways kind of looked back at selfie culture and how we've always had it, even if the technology has changed. And as you can see from this opening installation shot, where you have Cindy Sherman and Alex Katz and Chuck Close, one of the things that was very important to us in moving into the new building was to create interdisciplinary collection displays. So not to have, like we had in our Uptown building, a gallery for photography, a gallery for film and video, but really to think the way that artists think, because at the Whitney, we like to foreground the artist's voice and the artist's perspective, and to bring all of these otherwise disparate media together. And something else that we've been really trying to do with these shows is think about what is an icon of the collection. And so I mentioned Hopper and O'Keeffe, two artists that many people associate with the institution. You see Andy Warhol on this image. But how in our practice are we actually in the business of creating icons? And how can we create new icons? And so that's very much something that this exhibition was trying to do. You see this Barclay Hendricks painting that we had a fabulous new restoration of in order to be able to include it in the exhibition. And then most specifically, this Rosalind Drexler painting on your right of Marilyn Monroe being chased by paparazzi, and then this Alan Darkangelo painting in the center of Jackie Onassis, and thinking about, again, how do we take different voices, a woman artist in a kind of a moment of pop art who may not be otherwise seen as a canonical figure, and put these voices back into the conversation. So the second of these projects was called An Incomplete History of Protest. And in that title, we've actually kind of joked subsequently that all of these shows should just be called An Incomplete History of Insert Subject Matter here, because that's really what we're telling. We're not telling the history of protest art, we're telling the history of protest art as collected by the Whitney Museum, and that is a very particular angle. And this was very much a show in response to our current moment and our climate, and thinking about how artists right now are really returning to protest as a form, as subject matter, and how has that played out over the decades in other, kind of flashpoint moments in American history. And it was a very challenging show. We got some incredible new acquisitions out. One I'm particularly proud of because I was a part of it, this Merrill ukulele, I Make Maintenance Art 1 hour every day. That's this incredible document. It was actually made at the Whitney during a biennial, working with all of the behind-the-scenes labor that allows the museum to function and look as sparkling clean as it does every day. And then the most recent of these shows was called Programmed, looking at computational art, so how the ideas of programming, the computer code, have played out kind of literally and then more metaphorically throughout the last number of decades. And the impetus for this show, while it expanded greatly, was an incredible new restoration of this Namjoon Pike fin de siècle, which you see in this installation shot. It had been seen in a Whitney Biennial. I will say Whitney Biennial as many times as you can stand today, because so much of our history is written through those challenging and often groundbreaking exhibitions. And so then I come to what I really want to talk to you about today is the show that I'm working on right now, and maybe this was all a little bit of a way to talk about the project that's occupying my time. I start installing it in 2 weeks, so it's hard to think about almost anything else, but is the next in this series, and it's called Making Knowing Craft in Art. I think in thinking back about the ways that we've been challenging the canon and thinking about our collection, a lot of the work we've been doing also in our temporary exhibitions has often been thinking about identity, who's been left out of the conversation and why, and that often brings up conversations of gender, race, and class. And you might be thinking, well, why am I talking about that when I'm talking about a show about craft? And really the impulse behind this show is to look at materials, forms, mediums, and aesthetics that have regularly been marginalized in the conversation, and marginalized really because they are associated with people who have been marginalized. And how can we put all of these works on view that have almost never been seen or haven't been seen in a really long time in our collection, and kind of celebrate these other ways of working and really challenge the conversations we have about aesthetics and materials with this kind of political impulse. So the show will start with this fantastic Ree Morton installation that we have called Signs of Love. And the reason we're starting the show with this piece is because if you're a craft scholar, you would kind of laugh me off the podium right now and say that this is not craft in any way. But we wanted to really begin the show by saying we're not thinking just about studio craft, but we're thinking about the decorative, the feminine, things that are associated with craft, and materials, again, that are often left out. So the show is a kind of traditional march through art history from the 1950s forward. We begin in the 1950s because historically of the radical changes that happened materially at that time. Kind of two major things happen in that moment. There's obviously the exile from Europe of many, many artists, and the kind of Bauhaus interdisciplinary philosophy lands on our shores, most notably with Black Mountain College, of which I'm looking at my colleague Megan, because the Guggenheim so well known for Joseph Albers, but here we're really foregrounding Annie Albers and her incredible innovations in materials and all of the people that she taught and influenced. And then the other kind of major moment we're featuring with work by Leonard Tawney, as well as Agnes Martin and Wilson, is this group of artists in Coenties Slip in Lower Manhattan, a group that's often more well known for the male figures who were working together at that time, but where there were really challenging conversations about line, thread, the grid, and we often forget that the line and the grid are really intrinsic parts of weaving, of quilting, of these other kinds of ways of working. We then move into a kind of riff on pop and thinking about how objects are made and what materials they're made from. So one of the things we love to say is that few people know that Oldenburg's wife actually stitched all of his early sculptures, and that kind of invisible labor that you don't normally see. And also for this giant BLT, Richard Artschwager, the artist adjacent to him in this PowerPoint, actually hand-carved that wooden toothpick. So who makes, what do they make out of, and what are these kind of craft ways of working? In the interest of time, I'm kind of flying a little bit now, but we then go into kind of process-based, kind of eccentric abstraction, a wonderful chance for us to bring out our Eva Hess rope piece again, and again, think about materials in a different way. I think Eva Hess would kind of probably roll over in her grave that we're putting her in a show about craft, but how were materials and forms and the idea of a finished artwork being challenged at this moment by artists across philosophies and disciplines? And then we move into the 70s with feminism and civil rights movement. And artists like Miriam Shapiro, who was foregrounding a new way of working that she called femage, where she took all of these kind of decorative materials, doilies and pieces of fabric, things that, you know, really were frankly quite embarrassing to include in a fine art, high art context, and made a collage out of them. Or Faith Ringgold, who turned to working with textiles because it was something that she had really grown up around and wanted it to be a strong political statement. And here a piece with a quote handwritten on it by Shirley Chisholm, the famous quote talking about which was a bigger handicap in her life, her race or her gender. Then we move into a room dealing with the 80s and the 90s, primarily in New York. And while this room is really about ideas of devotion, about religiosity, spirituality, how these forms and materials come into these contexts, and how are artists often challenging their Catholic upbringings, embracing those upbringings, and really presenting these complex looks at kind of the role religion plays in our lives. This was also the time of the AIDS crisis, where hand-making and ideas of care, the politics of care, were incredibly important to many of these artists because they felt, frankly, abandoned by the government. And so how do you care for another person? How do you care for an object and yourself? In our second to last room, we have this glorious installation, which you can't tell anything here about scale and context, but this is a one-to-one life-size replica of a kitchen that Liza Liu made from 1991 to 1996, hand applying beads in every crevice and corner of this, again, life-scale kitchen, even in the places you can't see. So you see there's Captain Crunch on the table, and when you take the individual beaded pieces of Captain Crunch out of the bowl, the inside of the bowl is beaded. And it's really this kind of biting feminist work talking about domestic labor and what spaces are women relegated to and what kind of work is valued. And so the actual labor of making the piece reinforcing its message. And then we have a great chance to highlight some new acquisitions. In the center, this fantastic Simone Lee sculpture that was at her most recent gallery show, where she's really looking at African diasporic traditions and thinking really about the traditions of Black women and their aesthetics, and how can she represent that in a kind of otherwise very white space. Marie Watt on the right, looking at the building, the Mohawk steelworkers who really built much of Manhattan, of course, to the loss of a lot of life, and the blankets in her tradition. And then some more recent acquisitions. And then just to end, I wanted to give you one sneak preview of an installation rendering. Our final gallery is really going to be a celebration of material. And so despite doing this chronologically thematic march through history, we really wanted to capture the exuberance, the love, the humor, the excitement that's in so many of these materials. So we're taking almost all of the ceramics that don't appear in the rest of the show out of the proverbial closet and showing them off in this incredible way that we can't usually do with many other media. We can't use these 1,000-foot candle light levels that Renzo Piano saddled us with or gave to us so generously. And so we really wanted the viewers, who many people have experience with clay, touching it as preschoolers, holding the coffee mug that you hold every day, and to show them kind of what this material can do, its breadth, its humor, its great scientific capacities, and kind of end on that a historical note. So I hope you all have a chance to come to New York and see the show. It's up for 15 months, so you have quite a while, no excuses. And we're really enjoying playing with our collection in this way, and again, getting to challenge what otherwise seems like a very static part of a museum's exhibitions. So thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So next up we have Lisa Volpe, Dartmouth class of 2004. And Lisa is the Associate Curator of Photography at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Before arriving in Houston, she was the curator of the Wichita Art Museum, where she oversaw all areas of the museum's collection. Additionally, Lisa has held various curatorial roles at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and fellowships at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her current project, Georgia O'Keeffe Photographer, examines the little-known trove of artistic photographs created by O'Keeffe in the latter half of her career. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, I just want to begin with my thanks to Megan, the other panelists, and the incredible staff here at the Hood. It's an absolute honor to be back on campus, and honestly, a little nerve-wracking. I feel like I'm giving like a final presentation or something. But here is where my passion for photography was solidified, in those Hop darkrooms, and at the Hood, where my passion for museum work was born as a senior intern. Today, my position as Associate Curator of Photography combines both of those loves. The permanent collection of photography at the MFAH boasts about 35,000 prints. With works made on every continent and spanning the entire history of the medium, MFAH is an institutional leader in the field. In 2020, we will open our new Kinder building for modern and contemporary art, which you see in the rendering here. And the opening will mark the first dedicated galleries for photography in the history of our museum. This opportunity for display has encouraged us to reevaluate our collection and to rethink even those areas we consider strengths, a process which I'm sure is familiar to those involved in this wonderful reinstallation of the Hood. One area of strength we are reevaluating is our collection of civil rights photography. Images of this type were deployed for social rather than purely artistic purposes, and therefore they require us to ask different questions. How do they shape our understanding of the past? And how have they created expectations which need to be challenged? This is a complex topic, so please forgive my brief 10-minute survey. Starting from the mid-century to about the 1970s, millions of photos of the Black Civil Rights Movement were taken. The MFAH collection of more than 200 prints of this movement includes familiar photos like Dr. Ernest C. Withers' 1968 sanitation strike, and images from the South of voter rights marches, like this photo from Houston resident Fred Baldwin, or of sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, like Danny Lyons' photograph for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, while on the surface it seems ideal to house a collection of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement, it means that other voices and stories have been excluded. A collection, after all, is defined not only by what it includes, but what it excludes. And if we consider the museum as a place of power and privilege, then having these iconic and only these iconic photos in the collection is a sanctification of just one construction of history and one shaping of memory. There are equally legitimate ways to represent the civil rights movement through photography, and it's this counterbalance that we're now pursuing. Let's take, for example, one of the iconic photographs from Birmingham, and as a warning, some of these images are troubling. In 1963, student protesters, aged 6 to 18, trained in nonviolence by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, demonstrated by walking from the 16th Street Baptist Church to Birmingham City Hall. The Birmingham Police Department, led by Eugene Bull Connor, met the peaceful protesters with over 1,000 arrests on the first day and with high-pressure water hoses and attack dogs on the second. The most iconic photographs from the event, those we remember, were made famous by their distribution to and reproduction in the national press. Charles Moore's photographs were published by Northern periodicals like Life magazine that you see here, that catered to a mostly white readership. On the pages of the major white publications, these images made horrifyingly clear the plight of African Americans under Jim Crow. Images like Moore's, which John F. Kennedy famously declared made him sick, stirred white sympathy and ultimately support for legislative reform. This is clearly an important story for the museum to tell. It testifies not only to the brutal struggle for racial equality, but also the power of photography as an agent of change. Yet there are other photographs and other stories from that fateful confrontation in Birmingham. This photograph by Bill Hudson presents a different narrative thread. While the demonstrating students are scattered in the background on the right, adult bystanders crowd the frame on the left. At the center is a man engaged not in nonviolent direct action. This man is fighting back. Under attack from a police dog, he has drawn a small knife to defend himself. It is a reminder that even within the civil rights movement, not all subscribe to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach. It is only through knowledge and acquisition of alternate images like this one that the iconic is reconsidered and even redefined. The comparison underscores the youth of the protesters in Moore's iconic image and gives their nonviolent action the heavy weight of conscious choice. Alternate images shake off the dust of familiarity, and including both in the collection means telling a richer and more complete story about the events in Birmingham. We firmly believe that these alternate images do not diminish, but rather expand the civil rights story, and are confident that this is not a retroactive reading. Images like this one of a woman fighting her police captors were reproduced in the Black press, such as Jet magazine. Amid coverage of Martin Luther King's work in Birmingham and his calls for peaceful demonstration, the magazine proudly printed photographs of women fighting against police with a caption touting, quote, "Though women were targets of much rough handling, one went down swinging with 5 cops needed to subdue her." For Jet magazine and its Black readers, these images of resistance were not incompatible with the peaceful student protest or with the larger civil rights movement, but served to tell a more complete story. Beyond the example of Birmingham, we are following this path of alternate imagery into representations of our local Houston community, asking how the civil rights movement was expressed in a multitude of ways in our particular geographic location. It has led us to unseen photos of the People's Party of Houston, the South's largest branch of the Black Panthers, and to the Texas-born Mayo, the Mexican-American Youth Organization, a militant student group. It has also informed our acquisition strategies beyond the 20th century, such as these recent 19th century examples, which aim to add stories of triumph to the larger narrative surrounding the Civil War, and to celebrate everydayness, rather than only hold images that aim for didactic sympathy through scars or violence inflicted on the Black body. On the other end of the timeline, we've established a yearly acquisition prize for contemporary emerging photographers. In the prize's first 2 years, we purchased these incredible works, both of which confront the history of Black subjectivity and representation in the press, as in the case of Chris Graves, who you see on the left, whose powerful work traces the roots of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in art, as is the case of John Edmonds on the right, who rethinks issues of desire and the Black body. Our aim to communicate the complexity of the long civil rights movement and to tell multiple stories has also led to an exhibition. We're currently developing the next thematic show for the Gordon Parks Foundation, and our focus will be Parks's 1967 life essay about and images of Stokely Carmichael. In the long and impressive history of Parks's work, this series best communicates his position within the changing movement, presenting Carmichael's increasing calls for Black power and armed resistance against Parks's declaration that the camera was his choice of weapon. This work brings to the fore the complexities inherent in the struggle for civil rights. We are certainly indebted to the incredible scholars who have guided our thinking in this area, particularly Lee Rayford, whose work urged us to truly consider how history and the future are shaped by a museum's photography collection, and Martin Berger, who inspired us to seek out images beyond the familiar. And we're also indebted to our Houston community and to our wider audiences who have been so generous with their time and their willingness to exchange ideas. And I hope to continue the dialogue with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So next up, we have Joshua Chuang, Dartmouth class of 1998, who is head of the Wallach Division of Art, Prints, and Photographs, and the Robert B. Menschel Senior Curator of Photography at the New York Public Library. Previously, Josh served as the chief curator at the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona and the Richard Benson Associate Curator of Photography and Digital Media at the Yale University Art Gallery. And among his current projects is a new facsimile of Kukuji Kawada's groundbreaking photo book, Chitsu the Map. Thank you.
Good evening. I just wanted to join my fellow panelists in thanking John, Kathy, and the rest of the staff of the Hood Museum for organizing this fabulous conference and for welcoming us back to campus. I just took a few moments to enjoy the new galleries at the Hood, and my oh my, do I wish I could be a student here again. So when we were invited to speak about our institutional practices, I reminded myself that the term practice refers to the actual application of an idea or a method. So in my presentation tonight, I just wanted to stress the word actual, because whatever practice I have had a role in helping to implement has always resulted from an attempt to share things that have the potential to change one's life, and to put whatever institution that I work for in a position to be responsive to opportunity and also responsive to an environment that's constantly changing and dynamically changing. So I get to come to work in this great building every day, and I have to admit that I never would have imagined, even just a few years ago, that this is where I'd end up. Not just at the New York Public Library, but at a library at all. But I can say that my undergraduate experience here at Dartmouth was absolutely critical in setting the course. Since my background is somewhat atypical for the role that I currently hold, I thought it might be useful, particularly for the students who are here in the audience, to just briefly trace my trajectory since graduating from here in 1998 with a bachelor's degree in studio art. Like 50% of my classmates, I began freshman year fairly determined to be a pre-med. I'm not sure if the percentages are still 50%, but I took a basic drawing class my freshman year. It was meant to be a gut class, and it instead gutted me. It really changed me. It unlocked for me what it meant to think differently, to be curious about the world, to really train one's eyes. And what I learned as I took more classes, art classes, was that I was an innately visual person. So by the middle of my junior year here, I had finally decided to switch my major to studio art with a concentration in photography, which meant that I spent the majority of my time making up classes and to be able to graduate in the studios at the Hood, dark rooms in the basement, the galleries and the study room of the Hood, and browsing the stacks of the Sherman Art Library, where I made very liberal use of its borrowing policy. It was at the Hood that I first encountered fine photographic prints, which made me so hungry to see more. So after a few years immersed in the photography world in New York, I went to graduate school at Yale. And there I had the great fortune to be mentored by its director, Jock Reynolds, who had begun a very ambitious campaign to reshape the Yale University Art Gallery, raising the stakes for the art gallery and really for university art museums across the country of what should be expected from a teaching museum. One of Jock's mandates was to better integrate the Yale University Art Gallery's activity with the rest of the university. And this is something that I've also witnessed happening here at the Hood, which is so encouraging and so inspiring to see. For Jock, at Yale, this meant reorienting the entire institution, not only towards proactively engaging the students who were already studying art or architecture or art history, but also to activate almost every aspect of the museum as a welcoming pedagogical environment for a wider array of academic interests. It was an open laboratory, if you will, of deep looking and learning and creating, where there was always more than one way to see things and where no inquiry was dismissed. So the drive to transform this museum came from this challenge of how to unlock a museum's true potential. So I was very, very fortunate. I was given, or more accurately, thrown into opportunities to help catalog, interpret, and shape the photography collection. I was given opportunities to project manage publications, such as the 2006 bulletin summarizing the activities of the gallery that year, and also co-produce a special new acquisitions catalog celebrating Yale's tercentennial. Eventually, I was entrusted to organize exhibitions. And I did all of this without all that much formal training beyond what I'd gained here at Dartmouth. But I discovered that I had a different kind of knowledge to contribute, as well as an eagerness to learn. So I brought these experiences and these lessons with me to the Center for Creative Photography when I was recruited to be their chief curator in 2014. For those of you who aren't familiar with the center, it was really a groundbreaking institution. It was co-founded by Ansel Adams as the first of its kind repository for photographers' archives. There really wasn't anything like it anywhere in the world for another 15 or 20 years, so it was way ahead of its time. Adams, along with major photographers, American photographers, Harry Callahan, Frederick Sommer, Aaron Siskin, also deposited their archives there. And over the years, they added the archives of Gary Winogrand and Robert Heineken and Edward Weston, and the list just goes on to the ranks. So it was really a critical mass. But fast forward 40 years, they weren't the only game in town. There were many other institutions that had become interested in acquiring and preserving and providing access to photographic archives. And by the 2010s, it was an institution that was really, I think, struggling under the weight of its obligations. So I saw it as one of my charges to really make alive the things that were already there, to really try to make ties between the past and the present. One of the exhibitions that I'm very proud to have organized was this one. It was called the Pure Products of America. Go crazy. And it featured the work of three quite on the edge contemporary artists working in photography, Lucas Blaylock, Owen Kidd, and John Lair. And it put their work in a kind of catalytic dialogue with some of the mainstay photographers of the center, people like Edward Weston and his brother, his son Brett, Harry Callahan, Jan Groover, Charles Sheeler. And I think for the audiences of the center and for these photographers, it just made everyone more aware of this aspect of lineage, and it was something that that really kind of brought alive the potential of this place. In 2016, I was hired to work at the New York Public Library, and I bring this slide up because this activity that's happening in this room. This is the Rose Main Reading Room on the 3rd floor of the central building. This is the main business of the New York Public Library. So the library is decidedly not a museum. It is a collection of resources that were dedicated to making accessible and available to the public. We do have quite a vibrant exhibition program. We just opened last week a wonderful exhibition on J.D. Salinger, that you might have read about in the New York Times and elsewhere. But exhibitions are not our primary business. The way we think of them is as a demonstration, if you will, just one way of shaping a group of materials to tell a story. The aim of the exhibition program is really to inspire visitors to become researchers. So when I got there, I have to be honest, I didn't know all that much about the collection. Because I had the great fortune of exploring the collections here and the collections at Yale and elsewhere, I just hadn't had a chance to explore the collections at the library. So I didn't know much about them before going, but of course I quickly tried to immerse myself in them. And when I did that, I discovered that there were so many things I had no idea that were there, and all my colleagues, my peers in the field had no idea that was there. And I thought to myself, how could this be? Such an incredible resource, right in the middle of New York City. Anyone can get a library card and you can see these things. So it became it is my mission now to make these resources more widely known and more widely used. The New York Public Library is not really that well known for its art collection, but it is quite substantial. The library, after all, was the place where Walker Evans first saw this image, first encountered Paul Strand's Blind Woman in an issue of Camera Work. It's also the place where artists like Diego Rivera and Joseph Cornell and Andy Warhol looked for material for their work. And also where the artist Via Selmans discovered a worn cover of an early 20th century Japanese manuscript in our Spencer collection, and painstakingly over many years made a painting mimicking it that is now on the walls of the Met Breuer in her retrospective. Among the amazing things that are in the library is a very, very rare copy of Anna Atkins's book, Photographs of British Algae. This is a book that for most of the history of photography was unknown. It was sort of rediscovered in the late 1970s. Anna Atkins was one of the first women to practice photography and the first person to make a photographically illustrated book. We were able to organize an exhibition, the largest exhibition of her work. There's not much of it out there in the world that basically told this story. And it was something that the library already had. It was a story that was itching to be told. And I wanted to use this opportunity to also inspire the artists in our community to create new works. So it's been always a dream of mine to think of artists as researchers. And so there was a component of the exhibition where we invited contemporary artists to take a close look at this book and to go forth and create. And we had made a promise to show whatever they made, which was a little bit nerve-wracking, but many of them came through with amazing things. The artist Alison Rossiter took inspiration from the many samples that Atkins had collected. These are photograms, I should explain, of seaweed. She had a seaweed collection that she wanted to share, and photography was her method of doing so. So what Alison did was to use expired photographic papers and expose them and create her own sample set of specimens. Here's a detail of one of the works. Some of these papers date to the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, and all you're seeing here, those spots on the sort of bronzed image on the upper left, that's mold. That's just been developed. Another set. I'll just end with another example of an artist that's used our collection, I think, in a very interesting way. In this case, she hasn't just chosen one object, she's chosen an entire collection. Have any of you heard of the picture collection? Okay, great. I mean, I would have not raised my hand a few years ago if I was sitting in the audience because it's not a collection that was known very well known to me. It's got an amazing story that I don't have time to go into now, but it was started in 1915 as a clippings file organized by subject. So pictures of all kinds clipped by artists for visual people working in visual trades to have as a resource. So the artist Terrence Simon has, over the past several years, been working on this collection, and what she did was she took folders of images. This folder was called Mirrors, and you can see the kind of various kinds of mirrors that are represented in this collection. And she arranged them on her studio floor and photographed them, thereby creating this sort of meta and multifaceted look at this one subject. This one, I think, is called Rear Views. And the picture collection is amazing. It's a collection that we still add to, we still circulate from. It's still very much alive. And so come next year, this is going to be the subject of a major exhibition, the details of which are to be announced. But when it's fully displayed, it looks like this. And look forward to welcoming you to the library and to New York when we debut this collection. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Our final panelist is Liz Tunick Cedar, Dartmouth class of 2005, and Liz is the manager of Global Cultural Sustainability Programs in the Office of International Relations at the Smithsonian Institution, where she is responsible for leading new partnership development and overseeing the strategic planning and execution of global projects in art and culture. Liz works with national governments and foreign museums on preserving, developing, and designing cultural institutions, training museum professionals, and enhancing public engagement. She also contributes to the Smithsonian Institution's efforts to preserve and protect cultural assets in crisis. She has previously worked at several major U.S. museums, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Clark Art Institute, and the National Gallery of Art, where she was also a Crest Fellow. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks to the Hood for inviting me to participate in this exciting weekend and celebration. It's great to see students in the audience. We're here talking about the future of museums, and it's really you, whether you end up working in them or being visitors to and supporters of them. So thank you, students, for being here. I would be remiss not to start by noting the Hood's influence in my life. It was a visit to the Hood my freshman year at Dartmouth that encouraged me to take my first art history class, sophomore fall, with Professor Ada Cohen, who is here. While my path to this field has not been linear, it couldn't have started at all without that class, and therefore without that visit to the Hood. This past July, I was in Armenia. There's Armenia, nestled in the southern part of the Caucasus region, for an intensive week of project planning with Armenian and American colleagues. I lead the museum's component of our ongoing cultural heritage tourism program called My Armenia, funded by the United States Agency for International Development, also known as USAID, and implemented by the Smithsonian. Our program works across the cultural and tourism sectors with museums, artisans, festival organizers, academic researchers, business owners, and more, to help better document, preserve, and promote the rich history, cultural heritage, and traditions of the country, as well as celebrate the vibrant living traditions and cultural expressions that make Armenia a very special place today. I managed to escape the conference room one day, and I went to observe a public program that my team and I helped develop together with staff from one of our partner museums. Visitors take a museum tour and learn about the museum's namesakes, two influential sisters, each of whom had an important practice creating ceramics. Following the tour, visitors create pottery with a local artisan and paint their own ceramics. The program deepens appreciation of the museum's collection and the sisters' craft, but importantly, it also generates additional revenues. In fact, the program has increased revenues by approximately 32% in fiscal year 19, important funding that can then be reinvested in the museum. Over the past few years, we've worked to build capacity of the staff and activate the museum in the community. It's been gratifying to watch the visitor numbers increase and see the staff become more confident about generating and implementing their own new ideas. If my title didn't give it away before, you now likely realize I am not a curator, like my esteemed co-panelists here. After graduate school, I did spend a couple of years working in the French paintings department at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where I curated 2 small exhibitions. But for the last 7 years, I've been working at the Smithsonian in a variety of capacities, all focused on our international work. You're likely familiar with our museums along Washington, D.C.'s National Mall. You may even know that the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York is part of the Smithsonian. But fewer realize that we are the world's largest museum, education, and research complex in the world. We have 19 museums and galleries, 9 research centers, one of which is in Panama, the National Zoo, and a collection of some 155 million works of art and specimens. About 146 million of those are in our Natural History Museum, and you can guess what those might consist of. Our mission since our founding has been the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and we like to say we're everything under the sun, our logo, from deep ocean research to space, and of course, humanity's engagement with it all. A to Z, anthropology to zoology, you can think it, we probably study it. Our first secretary said, the worth and importance of the institution is not to be estimated by what it accumulates within its building, but what it sends forth to the world. We've held on to these forward-thinking words and now work in more than 140 countries each year. We are an institution that recognizes our work does not and cannot have national boundaries. For starters, our collections are international. We believe our research, and therefore also our exhibitions and programs, are augmented, if sometimes enrichingly complicated, by embracing and appreciating international perspectives. And importantly, we acknowledge we can only stay relevant by having a global awareness and by fostering cross-cultural understanding. How does this relate to the future of museum practice? Just as they are doing now, I believe institutions will increasingly consider themselves part of a global community and global conversations. More on that shortly. Our vision for 2022, greater reach, greater relevance, profound impact, really demands that we think globally. What are the most meaningful ways museums engage, inspire, create impact, catalyze conversation? This is what we at the Smithsonian are trying to figure out. This vision we have set has been pushing us in directions that we believe museums should be embracing, redefining what museum practice means for us. But we're also seeing important developments already taking place that point to future directions, developments that really speak to the changing role of museums. In the interest of time, I've distilled my thinking about these developments into 4 areas, which are neither exhaustive nor conclusive, that describe these future directions of museum practice. I believe we are seeing increasingly that museums advance civil society, support community and economic development, support cultural heritage protection, and inform issues of consequence. How do communities rebuild after crises, whether due to human conflict or natural disaster? Once lives are saved, what do people turn to next? Or, in less catastrophic circumstances, how do nations and communities navigate problematic realities, grapple with big questions, or simply feel inspired? Humanity turns to culture, our memories, our stories, the records of human achievement and expressions of creativity. We turn to the tangible and intangible representations of our identity and ancestry. The former Minister of Culture of Haiti, Olsen Jean-Julien, said following the 2010 earthquake, and I quote, "After trying to save people's lives, the next thing to save is people's reason for living." The photo on the left, taken during a Smithsonian visit earlier this year, shows the Assyrian Gallery at the Mosul Museum. There we have been working with Iraqi colleagues and colleagues from the Louvre to conduct a damage assessment and design a stabilization plan for the museum. In the photo on the right, you see the important site of Nimrud, an ancient Assyrian city that may be familiar to some of you as being the location of the Northwest Palace, or Palace of King Ashurnasirpal II, the original home of Dartmouth's 6 Assyrian reliefs. Ongoing conflicts, campaigns of destruction, political turmoil, and economic crisis over the past several decades have imperiled these and other Iraqi sites and institutions. Violence and instability have directly threatened heritage while simultaneously eroding Iraq's cultural heritage sector, weakening the nation's ability to conserve and care for its material culture and diverting much-needed resources to other critical needs. Since 2015, the Smithsonian, together with local and international partners, has been training Iraqis how to safeguard and protect movable and immovable cultural heritage by providing the tools, knowledge, and networks needed to preserve as well as stabilize and salvage Iraqi national treasures and important sites. Smithsonian experts are helping Iraqis restore their lives and communities. And closer to home, the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture wasn't just a big deal for the Smithsonian, but for the entire nation, and I dare say the world. 100 years after African American Civil War veterans introduced the idea to celebrate African Americans' influence on the country in a prominent place such as the National Mall, the museum opened its doors and insisted on grappling with hard issues and asking hard questions, telling painful truths, and examining global influences on American history and culture. Part of the museum's founding vision was to be a 21st century model for collaboration, dialogue, and reconciliation. Time will tell what impact the museum has on shaping minds and impacting behavior, but the museum has already played an uplifting role in people's lives during what has been a divisive and challenging time in our country. More and more, we are seeing how museums are critical bedrocks of their communities, providing much-needed spaces for education and programming, often filling gaps that local curricula can't fill. as well as providing jobs and incentives for attracting tourism and financial benefit. The National Museums of Kenya and the Smithsonian have decades of experience working together on joint research and scholarly exchange, but have never collaborated on educational programs to leverage that exchange into broader public engagement opportunity. Over the last year, I've been co-leading an effort that involves developing, testing, and evaluating a pilot school program for the National Museums of Kenya using the educational methods and techniques that have been so successful at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. In addition to following their curriculum, the program embraces a hands-on approach to learning that encourages students to develop new skills related to scientific inquiry. Such a program has never been implemented in the National Museums of Kenya, and we're proud to help the museum introduce this new kind of learning to Kenyan students. In Uzbekistan, our team is working alongside the Ministry of Culture and the local cultural authority in Ichankala, a UNESCO World Heritage Site made up of a walled city filled with sites and structures speaking to Islamic architectural history and local craftsmanship. Funded by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, our work supports museums and sites as tourism increases to ensure they both reap the benefits but also protect the collections and sites as visitorship swells. Every year, thousands of artifacts disappear from archaeological sites, churches, private collections, and public institutions. These items are stolen or looted and sold on the black market. And while estimates of the size and profitability of black markets in looted, stolen, and smuggled works of art and antiquities are notoriously unreliable, specialists agree that it is one of the world's biggest illegal enterprises worth billions of US dollars. Trafficking in cultural heritage began thousands of years ago, but over the past few decades, the phenomenon has unfortunately become a problem of massive proportions. Since 2009, the Smithsonian has worked with the US State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to train personnel on the appropriate US laws, international agreements, detention and repatriation procedures, as well as the identification, documentation, and handling of archaeological and ethnographic artifacts associated with the seizure of potentially looted cultural heritage. More recently, the Smithsonian developed an online training module specifically for the non-legal heritage and object-specific material to reach an expanded audience. The US government takes cultural property protection very seriously, and the Smithsonian is part of an interagency group focused on advancing coordination across law enforcement, diplomatic and cultural heritage partners, while also ensuring the public is aware of important issues related to cultural heritage protection. We have an entire initiative at the Smithsonian devoted to protecting cultural heritage threatened or impacted by disasters, and to helping US and international communities preserve their identities and history. The Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative raises awareness, convenes dialogues, delivers trainings, drives preparedness, particularly by engaging communities, measures outcomes, and deploys experts to stabilize and conserve heritage. The initiative's director, Corey Wagner, is in fact a former curator herself and is the recently appointed chair of the Disaster Risk Management Committee within the International Council of Museums, or ICOM. You may have seen her name in the paper this week. There was an agreement signed with the Army. The Smithsonian is increasingly going to be working with the US Army to train them on what cultural sites are and what to do and how not to damage them. We believe that as a global organization of consequence, it is within our mission to leverage our expertise and collections to inform global agendas set by policymakers, media, academia, nonprofits, and corporations. We also exercise our own convening power to enable important conversations between these stakeholders on subjects like climate change, biodiversity conservation, infrastructure development, immigration, innovation and invention, and so much more. This past January, I traveled to Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. For the third year, the Smithsonian was included as a cultural leader at the forum, and for 2019, I helped envision and organize our presence there. We put a spotlight on accessibility and inclusion, using an adaptation of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum's blockbuster exhibition, Access Plus Ability. The exhibition featured innovative objects designed with and by the disabled community. Among the highlights were a set of Nike sneakers inspired by a boy with cerebral palsy who wanted to be able to put his shoes on when he went to college without his parents' help. A wearable sound shirt that recreates the experience of hearing music through haptic vibrations, and a set of elegant, chic prosthetic limb covers that reminded visitors everyone is entitled to living with dignity and style. The forum included panels and talks about the value of inclusive design and the importance of accessibility and inclusion across sectors, Many business, government, and cultural influencers returned home with new perspectives and ideas on these important matters. I started this week in Washington, attending the 3rd annual meeting of the Global Consortium for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, co-hosted by the Smithsonian and Yale University. The conference title was Museum Communities and Equity. Years ago, I don't think we would have found ourselves examining such a topic. But there we were, investigating the role of diverse communities in determining how their heritage is identified, protected, and managed, discussing how communities are represented in museums, exploring new ways museums can collaborate with historically exploited communities, interrogating how we sustain heritage in the face of societal and ecological changes, and more. I feel lucky to end my week here, questioning and discussing what we mean by the new now, art museums and the future. I really look forward to the next 24 hours together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I have to say, just on a personal note, it's been so fantastic to be in close communication with 4 colleagues and fellow alumni that I did not know intimately before this panel. So we've had some really rich discussion, which I hope will continue now as I pose a few questions and we have this dialogue, and then afterwards we will open it up to the audience. So I hope you will think of some good questions to ask my esteemed colleagues while they are here. I feel like all 4 of you have demonstrated, as I said at the outset, that there is no one path to a career in the art world, whether you are a curator, as 3 of you are, or something else, something different that you may not have even imagined. And again, speaking to the students who are here in the audience, I think I, for one, didn't even come to Dartmouth expecting to be an art history major, as Josh didn't expect to do studio art, and certainly senior fall, as some of you are experiencing now, as corporate recruiting was happening. You know, I felt a little like, there's no corporate recruiting for the art history world. Sweating bullets here, but it worked out for all of us. But I wonder if there is something that has surprised you about your career path, and a couple of you touched upon this, or something about the art world that surprised you, or about working in museums. If anyone wants to dive in.
All of it, yeah.
I whispered everything.
I mean, I often feel like part of my job is just to constantly adapt. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you agree. I mean, you set out maybe on a project and you think you're going to do this one thing, and things change. The world changes around you. Sometimes these exhibitions take, years to organize, but by the time that happens, maybe the conversation has changed. And I think it's been really great to see museums become more responsive to their audiences. I remember in the lead up to the reopening of the new MoMA, one of our fellow alums, Sarah Suzuki, was singled out in one of the articles because she was, I guess, played a major role in overseeing the reinstallation. She's a curator in the Department of Prints and Drawings, but she spent an entire year doing shifts at the visitor services desk because she wanted to know firsthand what the public, the everyday public of the Museum of Modern Art wanted to see and what their questions were. And that went a long way to informing, I think, the way the museum looks today. So I think we're perhaps maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe we had as a field, maybe if we thought we had a firmer grasp on who our audience was or is, and now I think all bets are off. We have to constantly question our assumptions, and I think that's a really healthy thing.
I guess slightly tagging off of that answer, but in a slightly different way, I was just thinking about something that's really surprised me in working with living contemporary artists and following them wherever they go is how much, and maybe I was thinking about this a little bit as Liz was speaking and the places that this has taken her, all of the different aspects of our world, and not just our culture, but our world that I've learned about by following living artists and their passions. And it brought me back to my freshman fall, and apparently I called my mom when I got the course catalog, and I said, I'm gonna have to go here for 8 years if I am gonna be able to take everything I wanna take. And I haven't, until now, really connected my passion for following artists to the end of some crazy adventure with that impulse. But I think what I've learned to really love about this work is all of the things I learn about along the way that wind up in the work but are not about art to begin with.
I would just add to that I do think that formal training in this field has its value, certainly, but so does practical work. And I think one of the things that has surprised me, I alluded to the fact that my route here was somewhat circuitous. I worked at a law firm, I worked at a publishing company, that some of the things there that I was thinking about, what makes people tick, what changes people's behavior, what gets people attention, what do people care about, were some of the same things that actually I'm now thinking about in this field. So one of my messages is you don't have to go straight into the museum field or the cultural heritage field to necessarily end up there. There are a lot of valuable things you can learn being out in the world doing other things that can then be very applicable and important if you do end up in this sector.
And Lisa, just to ask you too, that you have worked at 2 different institutions and 2 different sized institutions, Wichita and now the MFA Houston. So I'm curious how you've had to kind of rethink your practice, to use that word, or different audiences, and obviously very different collections.
Yes. I will admit here, and maybe not anywhere else, that one of the reasons I decided to take the position in Wichita was because I had almost given up finding a curator of photography position somewhere. It seemed like, to me, from the outside, it was a game of musical chairs, that people were moving around and positions were being taken away, but no positions were really being added. And so I thought, you know what, I'm out, I'm gonna go do this other thing and make that my path. And so I spent 3 years at the Wichita Art Museum. If you think about the map of the US and put your finger right in the smack middle, that's where I was. And it was a huge learning experience because I was the head curator there, and I had to learn how to motivate a team. I often think that my time as a coxswain here at Dartmouth on the rowing team was actually very helpful for that kind of role, just get everyone rowing in the same direction. But I have absolutely carried those lessons with me to a much, much larger institution now. How do I, even in an institution that's so much larger, motivate across departments to get everyone moving in the same direction? And what kind of, what are my communication skills, and how do those have to change based on the different people that I'm interacting with? So it was absolutely essential experience to get, and just as essential as being on the crew team or being a waitress for a while. It's all these skills that you that add up to some sort of crazy luck of the draw success that happens eventually.
And Josh touched upon this idea that, sometimes we're organizing exhibitions or collection displays 3-5 years out, but there's an increasing demand to be responsive, to think about current events, the environment, race relations, whatever the case may be, and have a response within the context of the institutions. And Josh, I'm curious, because we talked about this on the telephone a bit, how now being at the New York Public Library, you are able to be radically accessible in a way, and how that maybe non-museum, museum context has actually maybe liberated your practice a bit?
Yeah, so I think the New York Public Library in general is not a statement-making institution, so we don't have biennials. We don't really have positions. But we do have collections, and of course, we as curators make choices about what to acquire and maybe what to pass on. But we see our jobs as collecting the diversity and the entirety of significant human endeavor. We're not just collecting for ourselves or what our interests are, we're collecting for the future. We're collecting for the scholars who are going to be using our collections 50, 100, 150 years from now. And so we see it as our duty not to let things fall between the cracks. And so in some ways, I think we're able to be responsive because we have so much stuff that doesn't get, we don't cherry pick in general, which makes the collection a challenge to navigate, and that's one of the chief challenges of any library is how do you make these enormous collections? And the Smithsonian, I think, is maybe a different scale of challenge. How do you make these? How do you make these collections knowable, discoverable, accessible? I mean, it's the challenge of every museum. And then how do you inspire more people to use them and make them part of their part of your lives? So I guess that's we depend on our patrons, our researchers, to do the responding, and we just provide the service and the resource.
And I would just add to that that I think it's really important that we think about all the things that museums do. And so one way you can respond is with an exhibition, and one way you can respond is with programming. And so I think that one of the ways in which the Smithsonian reacts to things quickly, and we don't do many things quickly, is with programming and convening conversations and convening dialogues. And much like Josh said, inviting people into our walls to ask them what they think. So programming and education, I think, can't be underestimated in terms of what museums do and the roles they play.
And I would say this is a good segue to digital technology and how that has maybe entered the museum space in increasing ways. And if the students get nothing else from me, it's that close looking and visual literacy are so key and so translatable to so many fields. But we are kind of thinking more about digital technology, whether it's part of our programming, part of our displays, social media, and how we get our messages on a more global scale for those who may not even step foot in our institutions or interact with our professionals. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts about that.
I'm just going to be a huge photo nerd here, and whenever someone asks this question about how museums are dealing with digital technology or social media, I think back to an article in the New York Times from 1899, in which the Met was lamenting the presence of visitors with these horrible Kodak brownies around their necks. And somehow the Met survived. Things didn't go totally awry with these Kodakers, as they were known, these evil fiends. So I think it's just, for me, in this long history of photography and digital imaging and bringing the world to you in that way, it's just the newest step and nothing to be scared of.
That supersedes my answer. So.
You know what? This would be a good moment to turn to questions from the audience, because I think we're nearing the end of our panel shortly. So I encourage, yes, please.
Josh referred to this a little bit when he talked about how taking drawing changed his life as a student. But I'm wondering, for any of you, has the experience of actually making art changed your professional attitude about museum work? And if so, in what way? Why? Should I say it again? Josh already referred to this a little bit when he talked about how taking drawing changed his life as a student. But what I wonder is whether the actual experience of actually making art yourselves has at all changed your professional lives, and in what way?
That's a great question.
Thanks.
Well, I'll jump in two ways. I mean, one, what I didn't say about Professor Kenseth's class on Rembrandt prints was that we had the experience of going to the print shop, and it was, okay, well, so there you go, I'm answering your question. You changed my life. I talk about that class all the time and how important understanding process is. So there you go. And look, I'm doing a show about craft. I think I was actually into the show before I took a step back and realized, oh, I've been always doing this. And it's actually the first time I get to really marry these two loves of mine. And oh, wait, why do I have to marry these things? They are the same. And their divorce in the world of cultural consumerism is false. And they should always have been together. And so that just has been sheer pleasure, but also in the research, I sort of took a note from that class, and my co-curator and I took an intro to weaving seminar one night because we realized we could not keep warp and weft straight, and we really needed to understand but I'm actually dropping all the words now, but, and so I still really think that's a vital part of my practice, even when I primarily work with conceptual art and things that are so far from the hand and making, but it still informs my practice.
And I would say maybe most people may not be aware that Dartmouth's art history major, I think it still does, requires one to take drawing. And that, or studio, yeah. And when I was here, you had to take drawing, intro to drawing. So one had to have an understanding of material, and I think it does so much inform your work as an art historian to understand the making of things, to understand process, even at a scientific level, which we'll hear more from tomorrow.
I'm laughing to myself because I am horrendous at creating art. I mean, that class was one of the hardest classes I had to take at Dartmouth. I'm not kidding. You know, sometimes I cry with some regularity, but I'm not kidding. I cried.
I don't know. I dislocated my shoulder on the skiway during that class, so I had to draw with my left hand. So.
But again, sort of focused on the students in the audience here, I also just want you to know that even if you too are terrible, terrible, terrible at making, there's still a future for you in this field.
More questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
I want to bring up the subject of cameras in museums. You know, we happen to live in New York, and we go to all the great shows that are out there, and you can't even move from one image, whether it's a painting or sculpture, because everybody's standing in front of that work of art with their iPhone. I want to know, what do these people do with the thousands of pictures that they take on every single piece? Some museums say no. Some museums say no flash. How do you feel about camera taking pictures of every single image in your museums?
Why is everyone looking at that? Tell us again. Well, I'll have to ask my colleagues to help me out with this, but there are definitely studies about how long anyone actually looks at a work of art when they're in front of it at a museum, and I think it's something horrifying, like 2 or 3 seconds, maybe. So for me, I choose to see it as a benefit, that now standing in front of the work of art, they enjoyed it so much that they took a photo and now they're taking it home with them. They're making it part of their life and experience by holding it close physically on that phone in some way. And so I
I kind of adore it, and I am horrible about when one of my exhibitions goes up. I'm checking social media constantly to see what photos people are taking in my exhibitions, because I want to know if some of the little curatorial quirks that we've chosen to make come across, and if people are really responding to that. And one of the best ways to measure that is through the photos they're taking on social media.
I mean, I agree with you, Lisa. I think getting back to this theme of not making assumptions about your audience, you never know if the person that's taking that selfie with the Mona Lisa is going to be the next great artist. Yeah. And so I think it's another form of access. I mean, like some of the policies museums have against photography really have a lot to do with copyrights and agreements museums have with lenders, and that's the condition of that loan. So it's terrifically hard to enforce, almost impossible. But I think, yeah, it's just difficult to make assumptions.
My name is Kate. I'm a 19, and I just want to say thank you guys so much for being here. I was an art history major, and this is an amazing panel to have here on campus. I'm really curious about, especially with something Lisa said, with kind of this musical chair situation, and that sometimes you might not always have the choice of your institution or the first choice institution that you're working with, but kind of balancing those institutional priorities that then you inherit with your own personal interests and agency in the work that you're doing. And if you guys could just kind of speak to that a little bit.
That's a phenomenal question from someone who's still an undergrad, so I just want to say that. I mean, I grew up at my institution, so it's hard. Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think I alluded to some of this in my talk. I mean, I've had to adapt myself in each situation and to sort of assess what the institution needed, what it had, and change myself. And that's been the great adventure of being in this field. And I think it's part of life.
I also think that unexpected opportunities come up anywhere and everywhere. And so sometimes, not to sound overly cheesy, but it's up to you to embrace certain opportunities and make the most of them wherever those might be. I think some of the institutions where I've been able to take on more responsibility earlier on were smaller ones, where it's easier to raise your hand and say, I'll do that, I'll do anything. And so I think that being really open to opportunity, again, easier said than done if you have your heart set on something, can really yield exciting results.
And I'm just going to do a quick plug for internships and mentorships that you can find there, because yes, sometimes it's not like, let me present myself at this museum and they will offer me a job. It's more building your resume, and I am so delighted that there is a move in our industry to have paid internships. I cannot say it enough that we cannot expect to have rich diversity in our field at every level if we aren't paying our interns. So there is that move, and that's exciting for people about to graduate. That wasn't the case when I graduated. And so, maybe you don't have a full-time job straight out of college, but great, you can get your foot in the door. You can show them what a hard worker you are, how capable you are, and that might turn into a position. We often hire from our intern pool or bring back people that we've had experience with. So I would kind of keep that door open too.
Something else I promised one of Josh's undergrad friends, who is an editor at the Whitney, when I was on my way out for this, I promised her I would say this, and this is a good opportunity, that there are also a range of types of careers within the arts. And so obviously we are representing, with exception, curatorial work, but there are so many different ways to be engaged with the arts in not-for-profit institutions and in other kinds of institutions. And so I obviously love the path that I am on. I don't know where that path is going, and I think that's something about this career I didn't fully understand, that there isn't a moment in which you kind of can say, oh, okay, I'm here, I've arrived. It's all going to stay steady under my feet. So had I looked back, back to a younger version of myself and said, you can do this, but you can do it in all of these other ways that maybe the positions are less competitive, or you can bring other kinds of skills to it, I would go back and tell myself that. Not that I don't love what I'm doing, but.
We're nearing the end here. Is there one more burning question from a student, perhaps? Otherwise, we'll come to a conclusion. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm a senior here and an art history major, so it's really wonderful to have you all here. I guess going back to the question of the digital, I was wondering, as curators or working in museums, how you anticipate the future when it's becoming so increasingly digital and we're so oversaturated with imagery and art online, how you intend or hope to keep viewership in museums, and not just people coming into museums, but staying in front of those pieces of art longer while not being the artist, how you can sort of help control those movements.
Well, maybe it's giving them a reason to come in. And, I think we think very carefully about our programming and what is there a thirst to see? What haven't we been seeing? What dialogues can we expand? How can we disrupt expectations so that they have to come in the door? They have to see it firsthand. And maybe they saw it on social media first, and it drove them to come see it. And sometimes, we talked about this afternoon, John, that sometimes it's the exhibition you didn't think was gonna bring people in droves, and it was. So there's not necessarily a formula, but or programming, as Liz said. Sometimes it's getting people in the door for a program, and then they wander into the museum space and find themselves at home.
I'm a bit of an eternal optimist, but museums aren't going anywhere. And I think it, as Josh said, it's going to be up to all of us to think about how we continue to stay relevant for audiences. I think if we look at digital as a way to access museums, it can be really exciting. But I don't think the experience of actually being in a museum and seeing real objects is going to lose its excitement for people.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I think we've seen the future, and it is promising. Thank you all. That was a really terrific panel. For everybody attending the conference, we'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. We start right back here. We've got amazing panels yet to go on this weekend-long conference, The New Now. So we appreciate you being here. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Have a great night.